Wow. Bonsoir tout le monde, on va y aller là. Je vous remercie d'être venu par cette pluie, d'avoir bravé la pluie. Effectivement, peut-être qu'on va parler de conditions climatiques ce soir, mais peut-être de manière plus scientifique et philosophique. Pensée au bord des mondes, c'est toute une aventure. Évidemment, vous savez qu'au musée, on essaye de capter ce type de réflexion. En tout cas, ici au musée, on essaye de penser le monde, comme vous l'avez déjà peut-être souvent entendu ou vu, selon une pensée, ce qu'on appelle ontologiquement neutre, c'est-à-dire sans hiérarchie, sur un plan horizontal. Alors pour nous, ça signifie surtout de penser un monde sans catégorie, lorsqu'on parle d'archéologie, de beaux-arts, par rapport à des interprétations qui peuvent être de l'ordre de la valeur d'usage ou de la valeur esthétique, etc. Et dans le magazine, notamment, le Magma, vous avez peut-être pu aussi lire ce type de réflexion qui nous anime en ce qui concerne ce monde, ce plan horizontal entre, que ce soit des œuvres d'art, des êtres humains, des bactéries, des extraterrestres, etc. Donc on essaye vraiment de penser un monde sans créer de hiérarchie et de voir évidemment ce que cela crée et quel type de concept on peut utiliser pour arriver à concevoir un tel monde. Donc évidemment cette réflexion s'inscrit au cœur de cette réflexion beaucoup plus globale, mais je suis vraiment ravi de pouvoir accueillir ici tout un panel de spécialistes. Et je remercie beaucoup Anissa Touati, la curatrice en résidence, qui est donc tous les mois, un jeudi par mois, pendant cette année et le semestre 2024, va venir avec des artistes de prestige, que ce soit dans la performance, que ce soit musique, réflexion, philosophie, etc., nous apporter ce qu'il y a de meilleur dans la réflexion contemporaine. Anissa, je te passe tout de suite la parole. Merci.
Merci, Marc-Olivier. Alors, moi, je vais switcher en anglais, puisque la moitié de nos intervenants sont anglophones. Et donc, je vais lire un texte d'une certaine manière. Before giving the floor to our guests, I will briefly introduce the evening. So the name of the evening is Thinking at the Edge of the World. So today the art world has long been dominated by debates about the relationship between nature and culture, blurring the boundaries between humans and non-humans. So Mohamed Amer Meziane is a philosopher and professor at Brown University. His work is an attempt to change the terms of this debate. First, it shows us that the non-humans that challenge us are the ones we don't see. It's not just trees or plants, but the invisible. Secondly, it redefines the Anthropocene as a secularocene to describe how our relationship to the invisible has changed along with the birth of colonial modernity. We have brought two artists and a climate activist to discuss these issues. Bulebezwe Siwani, whose artistic practice focuses on Black women, their place and role in the cultural tradition of African spirituality and religious rituals through which beliefs are performed. Johanna Hadji-Thomas, whose artistic practice, together with Khalil Jorej, questioned the fabrication of images and representation, the construction of imaginaries, and the writing of history, and Claire Farrell, activist and one of the founders of one of the most influential climate activist organization, Extinction Rebellion. And tonight, we want to create a dialogue between art, politics, philosophy to push the debate on the non-human further. So what their work has in common is they are questioning the limits of what we have learned to regard as reality, that is to say, the invisible.
Thank you, Anissa, and thank you, Marc-Olivier, and as well as the entire team of the museum. Yes, I mean this is an honor and also great occasion to try and and have this kind of conversation. So I'm going to start by, and thank you all also for coming tonight, of course, despite the rain. I'm going to start with an archive. So an archive to some extent that I met or encountered by working on different histories of the 19th century, notably colonial archives, and one of these archives was very troubling to me, and I want to try and describe this archive as a starting point. This archive is in fact written by a colonial administrator who talks to another colonial administrator. It's by the end of the 19th century, and it happens in Indochina, or what the French colonial empire used to call Indochina. And basically what the archives says is that it actually talks about coal, which is underground, right? And the goal of this colonial administrator is, of course, to extract this coal, and of course to use it in the context of extractivism, and more precisely as a fossil fuel, right? But what is interesting about this archive is that, of course, this colonial administrator faces an obstacle, right? An obstacle. And the obstacle in the French archive is in fact embodied by a mandarin, right? So there is an indigenous voice, so to speak, who's acting as an obstacle, to this kind of extractivist activity. So why and how is it an obstacle, and what is this indigenous voice saying, right? It says what's under our feet, right? This, what we would call a mine, where precisely you can find this coal, is in fact the body of a non-human, and this non-human is a dragon, right? So there is a dragon on the ground, right? So it means that if you go underground and try to access this coal, not only will you encounter someone, right, who's called a dragon, but you will probably reawaken this dragon, and of course the consequences might be problematic, if not completely destructive, right? So the first thing it tells us is in fact that there is, of course, or colonialism, so to speak, is premised upon a dismissal of this kind of point of view, of course, because the first thing that this administrator says is that this conception of the subsoils and the conception of the underground, so not what's surrounding us, but what is under our feet, the first thing he says about it is that it's a superstition, of course, right? Superstition. So it means he doesn't say, I don't know, it's not blatant racism, so to speak, because it's not a racial category that he's using. It's a so-called religious category, which is superstition. The second thing that one can say about that archive is that it raises a methodological question, because you might say, well, this guy is right. There is no dragon on the ground, of course, right? It doesn't exist. Of course it doesn't exist, right? But the problem is that if you say that, you're not really being neutral. You're just restating what the colonial administrator thinks, right? So you're deploying a colonial perspective, so to speak. If you say the dragon exists, problem is that you don't really have any proof, right? To say, well, the dragon exists, right? So what do you do, and how do you make sense of such a trace, right? Well, the first thing that you can say about such an archive, a trace, so to speak, of the history of modernity and colonial modernity, more precisely, the first thing that you can say is that we had to disenchant the underground world, right? Not only what is around us and things like that, but to really change our concept of what lies beneath our feet to be able to deploy what we call capitalist extractivism, right? It means, of course, also that non-Western indigenous conceptions of the earth is not only reducible to an alternative or other conceptions of nature, it's other conceptions of how the physical dimensions of reality and the metaphysical dimensions of reality are interconnected. And this is to some extent what we lost, right? So this kind of traces, sort of led me to find other traces that were actually going in the same direction, because I, started discovering that in fact, during the 17th century and the 18th century onwards, I mean not really onwards, but during these centuries, the point is that it started changing during the 19th centuries. It was interesting to see that European miners, in fact, still thought that they could meet demons if they were to go underground, right? So there is something very deep about our connection to the world and the possibility of meeting otherworldly forces that has changed. And without this change, without this kind of imperial disenchantment, there would be no such thing as this so-called climate crisis, right? Which means something else, which I would like to emphasize before opening the discussion, is that people we call moderns, right? We moderns, so to speak, or European moderns, if you like, we did not disenchant ourselves just because we abandoned the illusions of heaven. What we did is that we tried to make heaven real on earth, and by trying to make heaven real on earth, what we did is that we destroyed the earth. Because we asked the earth to bear the burden of heaven, whereas precisely the earth never asked to bear such a burden. So I guess, you know what, I will stop here and open the discussion on the basis of these kind of comments, unless maybe I take a last example and to open up the discussion maybe, because you might ask yourselves, what is the political implications of this kind of work? Well, another sort of semi-discovery, because precisely it's a very famous example. Many climate activists, for that matter, thought about what is sometimes called the rights of nature, right? Giving rights to nature, which implies, of course, the possibility of giving rights to rivers and other non-human entities that we define as natural. And one of these examples is a law which was implemented in 2017 in New Zealand. And this law is very famous, and it's quoted by various activists, but also, of course, by scholars, as an example precisely of this possibility of giving rights to a river. This river is called Wanganui. And if you read the text of the law, what is very interesting is that the categories that are used are very different precisely than the categories that you would expect, such as environment, nature, and things like that. Because precisely what is at stake is that this river is recognized not only as a natural or physical entity. The law states that both the metaphysical and the physical properties are being recognized, right? So it means that the question of metaphysics or the metaphysical aspect of reality is, or in fact the very concept of the metaphysical is in fact a juridical category. And without recognizing this dimension of reality, we're not able to grant rights or give rights to this non-human entity, which is precisely, if you like, the dimensions of the debate where that we sort of omit, if not sometimes suppress, when we only talk about rights of nature or when we only talk about this issue as an ecological or purely environmental issue. The other very interesting thing about this law is that it's not only saying that this river has both physical and metaphysical properties that need to be recognized or acknowledged, it also says that what we see as water is in fact part of a broader entity which is called Te Awa Tupua. And this broader entity is precisely defined as a living being and as a spiritual being, right? And so in other words, if we don't find a language to make sense of these dimensions of reality, or if we decide that these dimensions of reality are in fact not real, then in fact the very possibility of granting rights to so-called nature in fact become impossible. So these are, you know, a few examples of what is at stake by trying to, you know, so to speak, change the terms of these debates and try to sort of make sense of these non-visible, non-human, so to speak. And this time I will really stop there. And next, yeah. So Claire, you have to go first, apparently.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you for that. When I first met Mohammed, we talked at length about a lot of this stuff, and the parallels for me are many with all of the thinking that preceded our movement, Extinction Rebellion. I recently was involved in a court case in England because I smashed the windows of a bank, and a jury acquitted us for more than £500,000 of damage. I know, right, it's good, isn't it? And for me, this has also been a really interesting thing to reflect on as an interaction that we have with something which is not human, and particularly sharpened my personal attention to the nature of the laws that we live with and how ordinary we kind of think it is for a legal system to basically be built in the majority sense to protect property, whether that's physical property, finance, money, intellectual property, and so on. And one of the things that we launched our movement with was a declaration of rebellion. So we, in 2018, stood in front of the Houses of Parliament, just a few people. It was bigger than I expected, but it was about 1,000 people almost. And we read out a declaration, and it said, one part of it was sort of following what I think is a tradition in British kind of political thinking and life, that the social contract is broken if the government is dragging you into collapse and dereliction, and they're going to destroy the nation. And so we said, when the government and the law fail to provide any assurance of adequate protection as well as security for its people's well-being and the nation's future, it becomes the right of the citizens to seek redress in order to restore dutiful democracy and to secure the solutions needed to avert catastrophe and protect the future. It becomes not only our right, it becomes our sacred duty to rebel. And with reading that out, we committed ourselves to move into open rebellion against the state, which is what we've been doing for 5 or 6 years now. And I guess, you know, a lot of the sentiment behind that was sort of culminated in the final line, which says we refuse to bequeath a dying world to the next generation. We can see what's happening. This is a very dark hour, and we refuse to do nothing. And actually, it's our right to do something about this. And to me, the idea of the sacred, the conversations that we've had about secularized society and what it means to live in what I feel is, in Britain at least, you know, a community, a society which doesn't actually really recognize anything as sacred, apart from maybe a pane of glass, which is why I think it was such a good idea to go and smash it. It's also true that when you live in a time when what has happened over the course of, you know, many, many years, you are living in a society that is deciding intentionally to like kill the next generation and destroy massive swathes of the planet. You're watching international negotiations that basically are a suicide agreement with many countries that will literally disappear underwater or become completely uninhabitable. And you know that your children are probably going to suffer extreme hardship if you get away with not having to live with it yourself, which I think actually it's much worse than most people think, and Europeans are going to be wondering why there's no food on the shelves within our lifetimes easily. When you live in a society that is undertaking that scale of transgression of your core humanity, of your core values, then I think it becomes, to me, a question of what should you do and what could you do as an individual in those circumstances. And so I feel that people stopping daily life by sitting in the roads or throwing soup all over a painting or taking a hammer and chisel to a bank and breaking the windows is entirely appropriate, because at the moment we are living in circumstances which quite frankly shouldn't exist. And I think there's a cause for people to try to understand what it means to make an effective intervention and what it means to get people to pay attention to what's going on. So I was listening to this lecture series by a neuroscientist, and he was talking about shamanic practices and how people go through different processes in different cultures all over the world to try and reach a state of enlightenment or to find a higher place or to gain greater insights. And what I noticed from what they were saying is that all of the best techniques are very disruptive. You do sleep deprivation, you do days and days and days of meditation, you take psychedelic medicine so that you are literally in a different mental state. There are many different things that people do, or you just regularly have a routine of going to prayer, chanting, repetitive sound. There's lots and lots of ways that people go about this. And again, that's another thing that I think is seen as very niche in the culture I live in, as sort of that's something weird people go and do because they're hippies or something like that. But actually, it's a tried and tested, there are tried and tested ways of being able to sort of access something of your higher self. And this is something that I think we also, along with the lack of the sense of the sacred, we also lack even an ambition to be our better selves, because it's not really part of your ambition that you're supposed to take on. You're supposed to fulfill certain things in your life, but you're not supposed to become enlightened. It's not really a thing that I was raised to sort of respect. And so with the minimal resources that we've got as individual citizens who don't have £80 billion to spend on lobbying or fossil fuels or protecting forests or anything, you know, we've tried to make methodologies for ways of taking action that can take you to a place which may be far more effective than, you know, what people see as traditional campaigning, but also which ends up becoming what I think is really a kind of a life that you live in devotion. And the most effective activists, lots of them in my community, are people of faith. And so I've become increasingly interested in what is the difference for a Christian who walks into an action and anticipates a jail sentence and believes that they're following in the footsteps of Jesus and understands themselves that they're going to go into a prison cell and they feel right within themselves, they feel like they're in right relationship with the world, they feel like they're in right relationship with the country, and they also believe, because of their faith, that they will survive, and this isn't too terrifying for them. I think a lot of people, a lot of atheist activists, a lot of people who are far more sort of materialist minded, they're more interested in winning or achieving something, they're actually far less effective because they're worried about whether it will work, they want it to work, and then because you're up against these terribly difficult odds, when usually doesn't work, or it doesn't work as well as you'd like it to. It's excruciatingly painful and you get burnt out. And so as an activist, I've been feeling more and more over the last 5 years that questions of faith, questions of what effect it has on us to live in a majority kind of very secular society, which I feel, you know, doesn't have a respect for some of the things that I can see give us this inherent, like, enormous strength. And actually, standing in court the day of the action when I broke the windows, they tried to put me in prison the next day, and they described me as a dangerous woman. And I thought, you know, I was very frightened on the inside, and I was worried about being, I was frightened that I was being a bit of a coward, to be honest, because I was scared, because I thought they were going to send me to prison. And on the other hand, I thought most of the people I would respect the most in history would have been told by a middle-aged man in a court that they were dangerous. And, you know, it sort of spoke back to me about this idea of, you know, transgression and what you do when you live in a society that's so immoral that it's trying to destroy your children. So for me, all of this is an extremely important area of thinking, because I feel like often the discussions become far too sort of rationalist and materialist, and it's very limiting. And I think we need to be as expansive as possible, because, as I'm sure you're all aware, we are losing in the most catastrophic way, and it's extremely emotionally challenging to do the work that we've been doing over the last few years, because looking at what's happening and seeing it just get worse and worse, and looking at the COP process run by oil bosses, looking at the geopolitical mess that is just a big game between people who want to sell oil and nobody taking this seriously when we know what's happening is extremely, extremely painful. And in some ways, I would recommend that taking the sort of loving route, which I think is what the non-violent direct action work is about, is basically, you know, acts of love, acts of care, acts of compassion. Taking that route is actually also good for your soul. It's been very difficult for me, but it's also done me a lot of good. And in that way, I think we feel much greater relationship to the non-human world, weirdly. Even if I'm in the business district of London, I feel more at peace with the living world.
So we had a few, I mean, when we first discussed over a Zoom meeting, because Mohammed was far away and so was I, one of the things that I don't think we brought up, and that has just come to my attention now, is the issue of language. And the issue of language is that in the English language, there aren't words to say the things that I would say in my own native tongue. So if I were to speak my own language, we have the words, but what I've realized is also the issue, and it's always going to be the issue where I come from. I come from South Africa, so context. So coming from South Africa, I think language is a huge issue, because when I'm back home, and I speak my own language with my own people in villages or, you know, in rural parts of South Africa, we have all these words for all these things that you've discussed and we've spoken about, like metaphysics, the Anthropocene. All of these words exist, but in different ways. There's a different understanding that occurs or happens in those spaces. So I think the major problem is an acknowledgement of colonization and how our tongues have been colonized. So there's this huge, I think, disparity between how how people are privileged in the way that they speak and what they understand, and in the way that when we're back home and people don't have the economic resources to do particular things or say things, their tongues are certainly, they're cut off. So getting to that, I've been making work about water for a very long time now, and about spiritual belief systems which have to do with how we're intrinsically tied to the earth as indigenous people, and how those things are not separate. So how sustenance, food, respecting the earth, calling the earth mother, or, you know, we have different words for the earth, and everything that the air, the land, the earth, water, everything is living to us. So not only does it feed us, but it sustains us in different ways. So everything occurs in a system, it's cyclical, it's almost like a 360 kind of thing. So not everything then becomes, isn't looked at in terms of the West, I would say. So then I will go back a little bit and go back to something called the Witchcraft Act of 1956, which was passed in Southern Africa during apartheid. And what then this did is that any spiritual belief systems, practicing your own belief systems, African belief systems, so what you would call traditional medicine women. I don't know if people have watched Dr. Quinn, but, you know, something like that. But using herbal remedies to heal spiritual ailments, but also really physical ailments, which then led to a lot of people being arrested and a lot of people not practicing their own belief systems for a long time, which meant people were kind of moved from the land. But there was another thing that happened at this time, which was missionaries prior to that. Then during colonization, when Jan van Riebeeck arrived, or when South Africa was discovered, arrived and usurped the land. And what then happened is that people were also taken away from their land, and they learned new names for certain things and what to do with plants, etc., and medicine. So when people kind of move away from that, in, I think it was the 80s, the conglomerates entered, the medical conglomerates, which were Bayen, was it Bayen or Bayer? They entered, and then they started coming to traditional healers during 1994, when Mandela became the first president with de Klerk, F.W. de Klerk. And then they started asking traditional healers, what are the things that you're using to cure particular ailments, because they wanted to understand. They wanted to understand how to cure certain cancers, diabetes, just a multitude of things. And what that did is they took land, they already had the land, and they divorced the people from the land. But some of the medicines weren't given to them. So lots of people didn't tell them what certain trees were. So some of it was burned afterwards, so that the people couldn't go into mountains and, you know, take plants and medicine. But another thing that people didn't realize is that people go to the mountains to pray. So it's not seen, like I said, all of these things are seen as living beings, and they're seen as a place where ancestors reside. So we all have little spaces in our houses in rural places where we bury, when a child is born, you bury the placenta and you bury the umbilical cord, because it ties you to the land and it ties you to everything that, all the belief systems around the land, the water. I know that in different parts of the world they have different ceremonies when children are born. So for instance, in the Caribbean, they bury them either in the water or under coconut trees. I know that in Brazil they do different things as well. So we have, I guess how it's tied together in that sense is that as I'm a traditional healer, so I'm Inyanga and a Sangoma who uses process of divination to work with spiritual ailments, and also I do this in my practical work because I think that it's important that we talk about these things and talk about different ways of seeing and knowing the earth. I don't think science is something that, philosophy is not new to Africa, but the academic Africa has been divorced from the academic, because I think again, language is the problem, the access to this kind of material and to this is something that we wouldn't get, right? So people in rural villages, etc., wouldn't get that kind of, how do I articulate that? You wouldn't get that kind of space to sit and be able to talk about to each other, at least, you know, to somebody else and say, hey, Bea, you're coming to ask for this. Let's talk about how you can, if you take it, you have to do this and this for this tree to continue growing. But what they do is they chop everything down and we have nothing left to heal and nothing left that's going to grow. There was something else I wanted to say. So respecting the earth is something that I think you brought up, and I think it's really important because it's something that we're taught as children. Yeah, we're taught to do certain things, and we're taught that it's a whole system that starts from cosmology. So, you know, we're taught that African cosmology is very important. We're taught that seasons start in September, not January. We're taught that the year starts in October, not in January. So there's certain things that our cultures revolve around the earth. They don't revolve around capitalism. And I think that's the most important thing. I don't know if I'm making sense, if I'm not. And so, yeah, I think that's about what I wanted to say. I think it's enough.
Okay. To continue a bit, to talk about another relation to Earth. So when I started working to prepare this with Anissa and Muhammad, with Khalil, my partner, Khalil, we work as a duo. We felt that maybe the best way to enter this conversation with our practice would be to talk about grounds and undergrounds, and to react a bit to the title and to this idea of what is under the earth, what lies underneath our feet. And I want to tell you just a bit about, because lately we noticed that many of the things that was interesting to us were related to those undergrounds. I come from Lebanon, so during at the end of the civil war, there was like a huge part of the city was totally destroyed, especially the city center, and so it became like no man's land. And the way they reacted to it, it's to do a very fast reconstruction, and so it was an ultra-liberal way of doing it. It's a one society, solidaire, that was partly founded by the prime minister and belongs to him at that time. So they decided that they have to have a very quick reconstruction. So they removed and destroyed between 80 and 90% of all the building in the city center, and started to rebuild. But doing this, there was a lot of ruins and remains, and so all those were taken and crushed, and to level the space of a new city that was going to continue the old city and create new grounds. But also they took with them some of the human also remains, because we have in Lebanon a lot of people, almost 17,000, we don't know where they are. They disappeared and we never found their graves. So in a way, I always had this feeling that all this had a lot of latency, and all those latency were still there, and all this relation to invisible in another way, you will feel that a lot of ghosts and revenants and latent things, and nothing was solved, of course, after this very long civil war. So you will have the feeling that things will resurface. And in Beirut, we used to say that this city has 7 layers of occupation and several cities, like several temporalities. We say that it was, and there is a book that talk about this in a very interesting way, called Berytus Underground. It's this idea that there's it revolves around the character of a watchman, Boutros, and he fell just in a hole, and he discovered a new Beirut underneath the other one, and there are strange animals, strange people, but it's with no light, but it's exactly what we feel in a way. And so very naturally we started to be, with Khalil, very attracted to archaeology and more specifically geology, because strangely, because the city was destroyed, it revealed also a lot of its archaeological grounds and its geology. And we started working with archaeologists and geologists on this. We recuperated the cores. You know, when you have to build something or to see if a land is, you can build on it, the friability of it, you do coring, you drill some cores. And usually they do this, they study them and then discard them. So they just, and we started to recollect them, to take all this, and with archaeologists and geologists to resculpt and reform what is really underneath our feet, and how we can see all those remains of civilization, but also all what is geological in this ground, and how to be able to understand also that what is underneath our feet is not like layered, like history that has temporalities, but it's like actions where sometimes the most recent, like we saw in Beirut when they reconstructed, the most recent can become very low, and the most ancient Romans or other can be at the surface. So everything is in a way is upside down. And so it gives us another relation to history and to its writing, or the relations that we can have with it. But was more and most, it was really interesting because our generation started working in the 90s, just after the Civil War, thinking that we don't have access to history. We have to keep traces of memory before all those capitalistic, real estate would remove all traces of history, but while removing and rebuilding everything. But in a way, we suddenly had the chance to be able to see our history in a very different way. And while working on archaeology, we fell totally into the vertigo of geology, because what is really incredible is to understand how the geologists can see all the relation of the Earth and its collapse and regeneration. And there's a word that they use that is became, in a way, the center of and the title of our works, called unconformities. And so in unconformity, it's a very special thing. It's like a rupture in time, hiatus, a gap, where two sequences of time that shouldn't meet at a moment and create something else. And in those times that we are living, all of us differently, but I always think of those cycles of reconstruction and possible regeneration. Because if not, it's a bit it's my way of caring, and I feel that geology has a lot to tell us about the way we could also understand what happened to the Earth before and how to deal with it in a way. I wanted to tell you about a story, because this relation to time, to underground, so this vertiginous, that vertigo that you have when you approach it a bit, and when you understand that there are so many ways of telling history, and it's not only one way that we were taught of. I wanted to tell you the story of a place in North Lebanon called Nahr el-Bared. So Nahr el-Bared is very close to Tripoli in Lebanon, and it is a place that welcomed Palestinian refugees when they had to flee their country in 1948. So they stayed there. And and there is a kind of extraterritoriality with those camps. It's like it's the Palestinian authorities that rule them, but in a way, there was a war in 2007 between Lebanese army and some Islamists that infiltrated the camp. And so they had to remove all the people that lived in this camp and to start a war, and a very hard war, because the Islamists will fight, but also hide in tunnels that was constructed by Arafat and the Soviets at that time, before 2007, but still there. And so the army, to just be able to cope to all those Islamists, had to destroy the camp. And they destroyed the camp totally, 98%, because there was a lot of mine and that were put there. So they destroyed totally the camp, and after destroying the camp, they started to remove all the ruins, and suddenly they discovered that underneath this camp there is something. There is like a city, a very old city, a Roman city that was lost, called Ortosia. And Ortosia was a very famous city at that time, and it minted its own money. It was very known. A lot of people were searching for Ortosia, because Ortosia, after in 50-51 there was a big earthquake and tsunami in the region, and so Ortosia totally disappeared. So, sorry. And so people were searching for this city and didn't find it. And suddenly it was there, Ortosia. And so archaeologists came and say, like, what are we going to do? It's like a mini Pompeii. There was a harbor. There was like, there is a lot of trace of this city, and we have to dig to understand what is this city. But in the same time, there are all those people, 30,000 people, that have to come back to their place where they live. And so there was like a whole conversation going on, like, what do we have to protect today? What is the most important? And finally, also, those people displaced, where can they go? They have to come back, because they cannot be displaced so many times in their life. And finally, so the archaeologist and the director of antiquities found a kind of very surreal answer to this. So they have decided to recover the city by a textile, a huge textile. The city is huge. So a huge textile that is called geotextile that protects the city, and then to level, to crush again, like to crush with runes to level this city, and to pour a concrete slab on it. And so the whole city now is rebuilt on a concrete slab that is supposed to protect Ortosia. And so Ortosia is there, like a giant sarcophagus, and we don't know what's gonna, where it will resurface again, because of course now the new camp has been built, and it's built on ground where you cannot plant anything, you cannot go it's just a concrete slab, and you live on it. And for me, it's like a crazy metaphor of our world, of this geopolitical madness, but also of the relation that we have with this world. And so archaeologists will say, before pouring this concrete slabs, they left some messages for the archaeologists of the future. saying that to explain to them why this city was not found, what happened, and they put some codes and to get access to the archives of all what they could record of this place. And we ask and thinking that maybe one day, if an archaeologist of the future will find this, it would mean that the situation has changed in the region, that there is a solution for those Palestinians in a way, and that so the camp is destroyed and Ortosia could resurface again. I wanted to tell you this story because I feel it's linked in so many ways with those decisions that are taken and that are a bit confusing.
Thank you all for these contributions. I'm going to share some thoughts and try to, so to speak, make bridges, make connections between what you all said, because there are many, overlaps. I wanted to recall what you said, Claire. So I'm going to start with the beginning, so to speak. By sort of rephrasing some of the things you said and asking questions from that point of view, and then I'll do the same with everyone, basically. The fact that you mentioned the trial, right, makes me think of the fact that, among climate activists or climate scholars, there is a sort of consensus, doesn't mean to say that it's wrong, that the main problem with fossil fuel extractions is capitalism, right? And the first thing which I think is important and interesting when we listen to what you say is that the first entity that one meets when one wants to resist to the kind of semi or end of the world that we're sort of beginning to encounter, so to speak, is the state. That is to say, there is a fossil capitalism, a fossil capital, because there is a fossil state, right? And precisely because of this reason, this fossil state is also a suicidal state, right? If only because it has the capacity. You didn't mention it, but we could mention it via nuclear weapon to destroy its own population, but for this exact same reason also humanity itself, right? So therefore, I would say and suggest and to some extent ask that precisely the question is not really what is not sacred. I mean, the fact that we're in a civilization where nothing is sacred, as you said, but the fact that precisely this kind of political organization is sacred and is or posits itself as sacred and is able to sacrifice us, right, for the sake of its own survival, right? And I'm also struck by the fact, and I would like you to say a bit more about that, if you can, if you want to, is the fact that you constantly talk about ethics and virtues, right? That is to say, we have been accustomed, and it's also the case in among the left or the leftist tradition, that one thinks about that one thinks that there is such a thing as pure politics, right? Politics, right? Without morality, without ethics, with no concern with the way in which we act, with the way in which we feel, with the way in which we cultivate a certain kind of body and a certain kind of soul, right? And it's interesting that what you said about some of the, climate activists who were people of faith, as you said, is that you seem to suggest that precisely you find the energy to question and, in fact, possibly change the world we live in, precisely by being connected to other worlds, right? Which I think is interesting. And the last comment and question I would have connects to something that we mentioned in some of the conversations we had about different spiritualities, for the lack of a better word, and the discrepancy, I would say, between the climate, activist practice, such as the one you described, and the climatic self-consciousness, which seems to be imprisoned in two different sort of options. The first one is a very techno-scientific analysis of the problem with a certain kind of belief in science, or techno-science rather, because it's only a very limited notion of science, of course, that is presupposed by techno-science. And the second one would be, and precisely it's oftentimes put in opposition with the former, is what I would call a sort of more or less diffused neo-animism, right, which we mentioned, which seems to be the only spiritual alternative, which seems to be sort of acceptable in Western public spaces. Of course, not to say that there is that it's not interesting, but in fact we should start by questioning this very word animism, which comes from anthropology, colonial anthropology in many ways. But I think I heard you say it many times, and I would like you to elaborate this a bit more for us today or tonight, is the fact that precisely this image of spirituality, right, more or less neo-animist, neo-pagan, and so on, is precisely what seems to alienate also people, in broader circles, to alienate them from the climate, some climate movements, let's say.
Yeah, I think it's a serious issue. I've sort of noticed over the years that there's this kind of well, my friend who's a designer who helped us build the identity of the movement, Clive, put it really succinctly to me one day very early on. He said, the problem with hippies is that they're very excluding, and they think they're really inclusive, but their culture is actually very exclusive, and it pushes people away. And so you have this sort of, one of the people who, I can't remember his name, a major person in the ACT UP AIDS movement, wrote an essay about this as like, nonviolent direct action as a tactic rather than a lifestyle. And in this essay, he said, if you go with your dreadlocks and your, sandals and your drum, and you go to the city and you're protesting something that's happening in the city, the people in the city just think that you don't respect them, because they look at you and they think you think that my culture is really horrible and ugly, and you think that it's right to be who you are, to be a big hippie. So it's why I kind of have always thought it's extremely interesting to look at the way that activists present themselves. And we talked a lot about how we might dress. We think about Martin Luther King going and marching through the streets dressed as if they're going to church, or the suffragettes in Britain dressed in matching outfits and sashes. They were immaculate. And then you look at I don't know what comes to mind if you think about the climate movement, but certainly, especially in the UK, because the mainstream media has made a big effort to make us look like we're just a load of hippies that, wear sandals and outdoor jackets, and they make jokes about how people don't wash enough. Then you have this kind of perception of that kind of hippie culture, which is actually, it's not very inclusive to like everybody in British society today. And that's a problem if that's also associated with the kind of spiritual position that you think is valuable to take, which may be something like animistic, it may be something that reaches back into your roots of paganism, which arguably there's a lot going for, exploring those things and trying to connect with other ways of knowing and thinking about things, which offer you a perspective which is less likely to fall into the traps of materialist, capitalist, racist, misogynists, blah, blah, blah. It's possible to go towards spiritual conversations that are capable of capturing more of a oneness in a British cultural way, I guess, if you sort of lean into those spaces. But I've seen that it becomes quite, sometimes it just feels like it's culturally alienating for people. And I have seen activists trying to, have a ceremony on the streets of London and noticing that the young black activists who've come from BLM are looking at these white hippies from the countryside and they're going, whoa, what are you guys doing? Like, that's not like, I don't hang around with people like you. and this is a problem because I think nobody talks about it. And actually, it goes back to what I was saying before about not feeling like we've got anything left in my culture that respects people's longing for even just like self-inquiry. It's like, are you doing something weird, or are you just seeing a psychotherapist? Because I can understand that. But if you're going for other kinds of treatments, or if you're interested in like exploring other different practices for keeping yourself well, or even group practices that people think is a bit strange, you're part of this like sort of weird culture. And as a fashion designer and a person who's kind of interested in how you bridge like through more mainstream culture into people's lives with, bringing this stuff to life, it's a tender business trying to do that well, because it can so easily become something that I think people don't really think is for them, and then they're switched off. It's like, oh no, that's not for me, so I just look away. And the mainstream media have done an extremely good job, and I think they're probably doing a similarly good job in a lot of other countries, mainly because of the network of people around the world, the Atlas think tank network and others who connect people globally in order to have a good strategy for how you, prop up fossil capital and neoliberalism and free market fundamentalism, and how you make sure that you destroy the opposition. And you can see the strategies. When I talk to activists in Germany, the narratives in their newspapers are the same as the narratives in our newspapers. And one of the things that they want to do is destroy the person that you are. And it's very well known in the sort of climate denial science, if you like, the science of bullshitting people, which was developed for tobacco and then used on big oil. One of the major tactics for those people was to not fight the information, but to destroy the individual who's the main spokesperson for it. Because once you've just derelicted their reputation, it doesn't really matter what they say or whether they're right. And that's what they've been doing to climate activists, and they've been doing it really hard in the UK. And so, of course, if you're seen as being culturally a bit sort of alternative and a bit weird, and you get pushed to look more weird, it becomes harder and harder for you to relate to the general public. And we set up Extinction Rebellion to be a mass movement, to be non-partisan, to be multi-faiths welcome, to be atheists welcome, to be scientists welcome, to be, and that's the strategy, I would say, that's also been weaponized in a sort of very, very intentional way to try and make us look like we're not the kind of people that you want to hang around with. But the truth is, when people show up to our protests in the streets, they'll be very amazed about the amount of different people that they meet who are up for working together, even though they're not the same, and they don't agree on absolutely everything, and they don't need to in order to be able to work on a big existential risk scenario where everybody is kind of trapped in a situation together. And the other thing I just want to say about a lot of this conversation has been about things that are underground, or things that you may get out of underground. And, for me, certainly the climate movement has been so deep in science that it's not really held up narratives that are relatable to the sort of spirit of yourself as a human being. Nobody's really going to get off their sofa and go and glue themselves to the road just thinking about carbon atoms. It's like, that's not how human beings work. So you have to make it about other stuff. And I stood in the stand in court and said, you know, I did this because of the suffrage movement who broke windows, because of the Chartists who broke windows before them to try and get votes for men. And this was about me trying to access my ancestry and understanding what they did and thinking perhaps that is a way that I might try to become a worthy ancestor in these very unprecedented times. And I find that a strange thing for me to say because I don't know much about my ancestry and I don't feel very connected to my land or the long history of my family. But what's really struck me in the past talking about fossil fuels is that if you think about the fact that it is made up of very, very ancient, dead, living beings, that it's like digging up your ancestors and burning them. And then it becomes a very different conversation when you think about it like that, than just, oh, it's a bit bad because it's going to make too much pollution and that's a really bad thing to do, but I still want to drive my car. It's like, no, you're burning your ancestors so that you can go to a job in a traffic jam that you hate, so that you can kill your children and the next generation, because for what? What's that about? It's like you can reframe everything when you see it in this sort of language of ancestry, I think, and that's another thing which I feel it's very difficult for me to get access to that way of thinking, because it just doesn't feel present in my life. I've had to work quite hard to try and think about it and position myself in it and then say it out loud. It doesn't come naturally.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Claire, for these insights. Yes, in fact, you mentioned it, and this brings me to what you shared with us, Brûlé Bézoué, about precisely ancestrality. And the first thing I wanted to share with you, and maybe I'm over-interpreting, but you seem to say that in fact what we call nature is in fact from another point of view not completely nature, or the land is not only the land, precisely because it's full of other lives, ancestral lives, that precisely, the question is not really whether it exists or not. The question is whether we have the capacity or not, right? Whether we have the forms of life that enable us, right, to be connected with these dimensions of reality or not, right? And it's interesting, and I remember when we talked about that, I didn't know, in fact, the example you mentioned, that is to say the Witchcraft Act of 1956, but I was fascinated by the fact that, if you like, it shows us that colonialism is also about trying to alienate people from, these capacities, right, that they are able to cultivate, right? Hence the fact that what you're saying is also sort of reconfiguring or changing the very ways in which we can think about another disaster, which is the colonial disaster, right? And that people don't always connect with the global disaster we're facing, but in fact is intimately connected. That this disaster is not only a racial economic oppression, of course it is, right? And to some extent, anti-colonialist movements have emphasized these dimensions, material dimensions, rightly so, of course. But it shows us also that colonialism is also an anti-metaphysical activity, right? Which disconnects people. It's not just about culture, right? It's not just about traditions in the sense of a purely cultural reality. It's really about how, through what kinds of practice you can have access, right, to other dimensions of reality. And the last point I wanted to make in connection with what you said at the very beginning was about language, and in fact languages, right, in the plural, and these questions of translations. One of the reasons why I started using this word, or expression rather, the edge of the world, and words like metaphysics and so on, is that precisely for me they're not really words that I think of as words that should be translated in another language. It's words or expressions I try to use in order to translate in languages such as, French or English and so on and so forth, notions that in fact are present in other languages, right? So to speak, for example, and it's also something we talked about because, and I would like you to maybe say more about that, is the question of liminal spaces, right? That sometimes you say you inhabit these spaces through creation, is that precisely this notion of an edge was connected, in my view, to this notion, or was a way of translating, right? Of making sense for us in our modern ears, so to speak, of a notion in Arabic which is called barzakh, right? B-A-R-Z-A-K-H, which really means what lies between worlds. So it's an edge in the sense that it's the edge of both worlds and in the space where they in fact separate and meet in the same time. Because if you separate two things, they are connected by the very fact that they're separated, right? They are connected also by the fact that you can say, oh, it's not the same thing. And from a more metaphysical point of view also, it means that this space is a space that, in fact, when we dream, or at least have certain dreams, they happen in this kind of space, which, in fact, you can describe as being and non-being, because it's the space between these binaries that we use to describe reality in a very poor way. Does it exist or does it not exist, right? And precisely what is interesting about the edge, or what you call the liminal space, is that it makes this very question completely irrelevant, right? So I would like you maybe to say more about how, in fact, arts, your artistic practice, can be a way of sort of making sense, making maybe certain bridges with these kinds of dimensions, precisely in a secular world in which, we don't have this kind of access, right?
Okay. So I'll start with the first thing that I thought about, which I forgot to bring up earlier, which was around dreams. And it was, what if, I always ask myself when I wake up, I don't know if I've actually woken up, what if this is a dream and reality is my dream? What if, there's a saying that we have that says, for every decision that you make, there's 7 other yous in other planets, other universes that have made the opposite decision. So there's different dimensions in which we exist. And so I always, when I went through my training to become a isangoma, translated, bad translation because language, called in English, it's a traditional healer or divination. So, but I think the term that is used mostly on Wikipedia, don't judge, that's the easiest one, is a shaman, right? So what I actually do in practice, life practice and work practice, I don't separate the two, right? Is work in a space which I think of as a liminal space, because then you become an intermediary between the living, the dead, and that includes every single organism on Earth. So the liminal space, I think this liminal space allows you to kind of sit in the in-betweenness of things and the in-betweenness of life. So that's why I say, what if my dreams are my reality? Because actually our dreams are our reality, but they're a reality in a different way that we've interpreted. Not only because what we tend to do as human beings is we tend to rationalize everything. So everything has to have a rationale, has to have a logic. But dreams don't allow us, because trees don't speak in this reality. But in this liminal space, every organism has a voice. And so everything that you stand on, everything that, things that you breathe when you go into the ocean to swim, these are places where when we enter the water as liminal beings, you ask for permission to enter the water. When you take something off a tree to use it, or when you eat something, you thank it, you ask it, may I? So my practice, my artistic practice has always been about demystifying the idea of this liminal world that I feel that we all occupy, but I don't think we know how to all access it, right? Because of this kind of rationale, logic, capitalism, etc. And I think that they're all really tied to each other. They're all intrinsically tied. Everything is, like I said in the beginning, everything operates in kind of like a 360. Everything is circular. So when you do something like this, there's a consequence like this, so there's a consequence here, which brings us back to the beginning point again. And that's why I'm saying that we can never divorce ourselves or kind of separate ourselves from really, the idea of religion can't be separated from any other organisms, because you have to take from what's alive, and trees are living, breathing. It's been proven. If you cut a tree, it bleeds. Might not bleed blood like us, but there's something that comes out of it. So it has a life. It speaks. And I always like the text that we spoke about, the subaltern speaks. So I think some of these subjects are taboo because not everyone wants to talk about them. Nobody wants to get into them purely because of the colonial mission, which was to destroy, separate, conquer, and dismember people from their own belief systems, which separated you from the earth. And, a realm which I think actually everybody has some kind of connection to. So dreams come to remind us that we all have I think I'll say it in a very poetic way. We all have a kind of a star in the sky. And why I'm saying a star is because I'm using stars because I like to think of each one of us as cosmic human beings. When we leave, we will either be in the sky, or we will be in the earth. Our bodies are buried physically here, but then cosmologically, your star moves to the sky. And this is why ancestrally, when people search for food, or they can tell what the weather's going to be like the next day, or which season is coming, they look to the stars to tell them. And it's also constantly changing. I don't know if you guys know that about the system, but anyway, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, Julie Baseway has to leave us to prepare for the performance we'll be seeing afterwards. Thank you. Johanna, I was struck by the, as we talked about, we talked about it together, but I was struck by the proximity really between our different works, and about your constant sort of exploration of the underground world. There is, if you allow, I would just go very philosophical about this, so to speak, is that there is very schematically, there is a certain kind of consensus regarding the fact that, during the 19th century and so on, that there was a sort of primacy given to time over space in Western thinking, right? It's a very general point, but let's start from there. And there has always been, even in Western thought itself, but also beyond it, since the 20th century onwards, a willingness to sort of try and think exactly the opposite, that is to say, how to spatialize time, that is to say, how to think about time in terms of space, right? And I was, among many others, I sort of tried to, precisely do the same thing, that is to say, try to spatialize time via precisely trying to excavate not only things that are, hidden underground, but also to sort of write the history of what we are and what we do in this world by precisely looking at what happens under our feet, because there are many things we do, or many things that condition what we do today, that in fact are not secret because they are, you know, somewhere in heaven. They are in fact below, right? And precisely when you dig down, this is precisely where maybe you meet heaven again. But this is not exactly what I would like you to talk about, and what I would like to ask you is precisely something that has to do with how you think, or you allow us not only to think about time in terms of space, but to see what it looks like, which I think is fascinating to the extent. And I mean, there's something that you said about the seven layers, right? Which I would love you to elaborate, because I was not exactly sure what was the context of that. Was it something that came from sort of saying, or traditional saying, or popular saying about the cities? And you also use very precise, in fact, geological notions that I would like you to also elaborate more, because this thing that you talked, because you insist on the fact that, of course, trying to think geologically about time, but about our present, therefore about us, right, is not something continuous, in the sense that there would be, as you said, right, the first layer would be the less distant past, and so on and so forth. But so you're trying to think about discontinuity between times, right, if I understand you correctly. But precisely the fact that they can meet these different temporalities is because they're spatial, and therefore they coexist, right? So they basically become, and these dimensions of time have to become space to sort of meet, right? Yeah, and the last point I wanted to make, which sort of connects also the last thing that you said, Claire, about, in fact, you're right, fossil fuels as ancestors that we burn, is precisely these ghosts, right? So you tend to think about the subsoils as haunted or hunting, right? Because you use the metaphor, and maybe it's not just a metaphor, of ghosts, right? So this is, something I would love to hear more from you.
Okay. Sorry. Just to go back to this idea of 7 layers, it's something that we all say in Beirut. So Beirut is 7 layers. It's 11. It's kind of thing that we also laugh at, but it stays in your imaginary as an image. So the first time when we, by accident, went to see a friend working, and this friend was doing drilling. It's his job. He's an engineer, and suddenly we saw those stones and remains and sands and soils coming out of this deep way of digging and being put in like a wooden box. Suddenly it was this temporality that became totally material. We felt that, those are from, it's saying, it's like a sequence. It's a sequence of time that we can see and understand, like, what happened underneath our feet and what are the accidents, the archaeology, of course, the history, and all this. It was a vertiginous palimpsest. So suddenly we would understand that space and time are so linked in a way, and those sequences of time are telling us something that we don't really understand, but we can experience. And when I think, and so our idea was to put those scores, after working on them with specialists, and also having the chance to have, it's like an interpreter. He will see this box that I don't understand anything about, and he will tell you, it's like he's reading about time and space and unconformities and all those structures that can happen. And we had this idea that if we could show people and see ourselves, what is underneath our feet, like with like tubes that we will pour inside a very experimental resin that was very difficult to do. Maybe we could like just walk into temporalities. And not only in one city, but in several cities and in several places of the city. So finally, for me, for example, understanding that Paris was under the water and came out of the water, part of Paris, and to be able to show the sand that shows us, that explain that. For me, it's a very concrete way, also differently from what you said, both of you, but to be able to understand and have a connection, a better connection with the words that are the anthropic, but also the geologic. And what is really interesting is if you want to have this sequence and what you're talking about, it's like you need to have the whole sequence and also the details. So you have to find a way to show the macroscopic and the microscopic all the time, the horizontality and verticality. So things that doesn't go together usually. And things has changed a lot because now we are able to have like drones and microscopic images. And so it's something that has to do with what our eyes can't see and that we can explore. And that can give us a chance to be able to catch something about this knowledge and maybe to respect more this relation that we can have to Earth. But you said now something and I forget. The last question, what I wanted to talk about. But maybe you were talking about the ghosts. That's and right. So it's true that when you have this, the problem is that I feel that we don't take enough time to be able to bridge moments of extreme violence with moments that we want absolutely to rebuild and to be able to act and live normally, where there are a lot of very violent gestures, being ecological or wars, and so we experience a very violent war, but at the end of this war, there was no time to be able to maybe have a relation to the people that left us, or that people that we can't find, that we don't. And so I feel that maybe this idea of going very fast, this acceleration, always acceleration, that is a problem also and the result of the climate catastrophe is also the fact that it brings back some spirits, some ghosts. And you know, in this part of in the region where I come from, there is a lot of beliefs that are not totally the beliefs that, for example, there are divinities, there is a lot of miracles. You know, there are things that we don't try to understand. And so also you have the feeling that everything is haunted because the question, there is no resolution to some of the questions. So you have to live with your ghost. Because if you, it's like a friend wrote, Jalal Toufi, he wrote about this and did a parallel with Hamlet. So you see the mother in Hamlet, she doesn't see the ghost. And she's like a zombie. She doesn't feel, she doesn't react, while the son, he has a connection with the ghost. So if you have a connection with the ghost, you don't become a zombie. He used it zombie in the Haitian signification, the fact that you are related to the rest. You are related also to your history, to your ancestor, to the earth, and so you accept the fact to accept to live with your ghost. All of them, the one the one also that, and all those latencies that you cannot master and control.
Thank you. Thank you all. That was very dense. I'm very, very happy to see that different of these themes that I've been trying to think about actually resonate with, many things that have been done artistically and politically, and in fact, both surprised, happy, and destabilized, in fact, by these proximities, because they're going to help us, I hope, at least me, to think again about all these things. There are a few things I wanted to say, but I have the feeling that, you know, this is really the time for us to maybe stop here, make a short break before the performance. So I would like to, you know, thank everyone for showing up and listening, and you're more than welcome. And thank you, all of you, for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.